Hello, everybody. Welcome to Stat in DC, the policy prescription. I'm Catherine McPhail, programmer for editorial events here at Stat. I hope everyone has a good cup of coffee and is ready for an exciting morning. We have a really great lineup today. We have Don O'Connell from the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response, Senator Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire, and Stat's own Washington correspondents. As you all are well aware, there's a major election coming up, so we have a lot to talk about today, and we would really like to hear from you all. We do take audience Q&A. You will see me or Matt Herper walking around with a microphone, and we take it during the session. There's no need to wait till the end, so please don't be shy. Lastly, I would like to say a very big thank you to our sponsor, Alexion AstraZeneca Rare Disease. And with that, I will pass things off to Rick Burke, Stat's co-founder and executive editor.
Thanks, Catherine. Morning, everyone. We usually don't do morning events in DC. We do evening events, so we thought we'd mix it up a little bit. And it's great to see all of you bright-eyed and here. And despite the rain, the snow, sleet, whatever you got here. So thanks for joining us. In November, Stat will be, it's hard to believe, but will be 9 years old. And we were just chatting out there, and I remember this story when no one knew what Stat was, and we're sitting in our offices in Boston, and a guy named Martin Swartzrelli, who at the time was not in jail yet or anything like that, he said, "Stat is a real outfit." And I thought, oh my God, someone like it's a big name in our world is legitimizing Stat. So I had it blown up and put all over the offices. Legitimate. And then, of course, we know what happened to him, and he hates Stat, and it's all bad. But that's how far we've come in the last 9 years. We now have like 115 people in, as I said, based in Boston. But we have a team. We have like at least 10 people here in DC. We have people in a big team in New York. Northern, Southern California, Midwest, all over the place. We have a London correspondent now who travels throughout Europe covering our issues, which is a great job. You know, I just asked him yesterday, do you mind going to Paris for this biotech conference? And so basically, though, what we started with in terms of our mission 9 years ago remains pretty much the same. Our commitment to trustworthy, fair-minded reporting from the frontiers of health and medicine, reporting that doesn't pull any punches, that's based on our real deep bench of expert, knowledgeable reporters, always in the forefront. We cover, a critical eye on scientific discoveries, as we say, scrutinize corporate strategies, chronicle roiling battles for talent, money, and market share, but always in the forefront is politics and policy. Our coverage here is very important. I grew up here in DC and spent most of my career as a reporter and editor in DC. So when we started Stat, that was the first thing on my list. We have to have an impactful DC presence, and we don't have a huge team here, but we have an impactful team where our reporters really make a difference. If you look at our coverage just in the last week or two, the stories that there's story after story marked exclusive, which means only in Stat would you have these stories. And these are, I'm talking about Washington politics and policy stories. So that's our mission, is to tell stories that aren't being told in this space. And we don't like commodity stories that everyone else is doing unless we can add some authority or voice or some new angle to the story. Beyond the foundations of policy and politics, biopharma and public health, we provide essential reporting on cancer, other chronic diseases, health tech, inequity in medicine, hospitals and insurance. We just added a new FDA beat here in Washington because we think we covered FDA from a lot of angles, but we think there's so much more to do. So we're doubling down on the FDA. I hope how many of you have subscribed, free subscription to our twice a week DC Diagnosis newsletter? Okay, that's pretty good. Everyone, it's more than half, I think, but everyone who hasn't should just go and sign up right now. It's free twice a week, and you get some insights from our reporters here. We also have so many other free newsletters. Healthcare Inc. by Bob Herman, which is a weekly newsletter. Our the esteemed Ed Silverman, who's very popular with the DC audience, writes a daily Pharma-Lot and Pharma-Little newsletter. Our Readout Biotech daily newsletter. Our Health Tech twice a week newsletter. And of course, our daily flagship Morning Rounds. I'm probably leaving some out, but you get the gist. I also want to just mention how proud we are that our investigative projects continue to garner major attention. For the second time this year, we were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize. Among the projects this year that are still ongoing are a series called Healthcare's Colossus, which is about how United Health wields its unrivaled physician empire to boost its profits and expand its influence. Another series that we were just talking about outside, Embedded Bias, which is a 7-part series we just ran, really extremely hard digging to get this important story about how race-based clinical algorithms pervade medicine and why it's so difficult to change them. We have another ongoing series, The War and Recovery. These stories have debunked an entrenched defeatist narrative that the American opioid crisis is a tragedy with no solution. We unraveled a de facto conspiracy spanning every level of U.S. society to deny life-saving addiction medication to those who need them most. And one more project, Coercive Care. It's a series that reveals how for decades physicians have steered sickle cell patients toward sterilization. That had never been reported before, and it took 2 years to sort of uncover this. And that's a series we had this year, and we have another story coming out in another week or two, where it's taken a year to get this, where we finally have data to back what we're saying, that in certain communities, forced sterilization is much higher than people ever could have imagined. As Catherine said, and I don't have to tell you, this is such an important moment here for Washington, for our country, for health and medicine in general. The election's, like a month away, maybe a little more than a month. Whatever happens will have such deep reverberations. So the discussion today, or this many discussions, are really timely and really important. And so thank you for being part of this event today. And thanks again to Alexion, our sponsor, AstraZeneca Rare Disease, and to every one of you for coming here today. And let me now return it back to Catherine. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Here to kick off this morning's program, on behalf of our presenting sponsor, I would like to welcome Del LaBelle, Head of U.S. Corporate Affairs at Alexion AstraZeneca Rare Disease.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here on behalf of Alexion AstraZeneca Rare Disease. Thank you so much for being here. And of course, many thanks to the STAT team and Rick and the partnership that we've had. We're great supporters of STAT over the years, and we're thrilled that you're hosting today's event. Also great to see so many of you here in the audience with an interest in policy and all things rare disease and the solutions that we can bring to the table that will essentially enable scientists, researchers, and the biopharmaceutical industry, and really the FDA, to efficiently bring life-changing treatments to those with rare disease. I think those of us that are in this space know that there's no question that we can do more to support more regulatory flexibility, more support from policymakers when it comes to policies that impact access. And so considering that there are 10,000 known rare diseases, 400 million living with rare disease, really 5% of those only have a treatment. And even more alarmingly, 1 in 2 that are diagnosed actually impact our children, for that matter. So lots to be done. And when you look at the diagnostic odyssey, the journey to get a diagnosis, it's long, it's arduous. It can take up to 5 years. Untold number of specialists to get a diagnosis, oftentimes resulting in misdiagnosis, hospitalization, and unfortunately, sometimes death. And so that is our North Star at Alexion. Our North Star is, in fact, the patients and the caregivers that are impacted by rare disease, and we aim and endeavor to do better. And partly we do better by serving those patients through life-changing medicines, the drug discovery process, and essentially bringing them to market. And just a little fun fact, Alexion was actually the first to crack the code, if you will, with complex the complement system. And for those of you that might not know, the complement system is part of your immune system. And when it becomes dysregulated, it actually can have irreparable harm and an impact worsening on rare disease. And so we've been able to build on that. And right now we are building on that, the treatments that we've been able to bring to market, but also an array of treatments that expand into other areas as well. Part of our mission, though, as I mentioned, is focusing on policy and regulatory changes that would enable earlier diagnosis and certainly preserve and protect access to care. So when you think about the diagnostic journey, it's long and arduous. We can do more to bring diagnostics through newborn screening and other advanced technologies. We can certainly do more to work with the FDA and the drug development conversation and bring patients into that process. So there's much to be done. And in fact, 40 years ago, there was legislation passed that actually created incentives, R&D incentives, tax incentives, offered other protections to encourage the very risky business of drug discovery in the rare disease space. We need to continue those advancements around that and continue those incentives. Because today, before those, I'm referring to the Orphan Drug Act, and before that act was passed over 40 years ago, there was roughly 38 approved treatments since passage, and today we have over 1,200 treatments. So we know good policy can be a driver of drug discovery and treatments if it's done the right way. And that's part of the reason why we're here today, because we're concerned about the Inflation Reduction Act. And the Inflation Reduction Act is a federal law that essentially takes us backward. And that's why we're so concerned, because under the IRA, certain rare disease drugs are excluded from Medicare price negotiation. On its face, it might seem good, but under the IRA, the exclusion only applies to orphan drugs that actually treat a single disease or condition, not necessarily those that have multiple conditions or indications. And in rare disease, science builds upon science, and it's so important that we actually have policies that actually protect that. And so that's what's at stake here today. And Congress can do their part and address this by passing the Orphan Cures Act. Very different from the Orphan Drug Act. The Orphan Drug Act actually had incentives built in. The Orphan Cures Act would actually reverse some of the harm that we think is done by the Inflation Reduction Act. So in addition to those other bills, there's an array of legislation, not just the Orphan Cures Act, but an array of legislation that is aimed at protecting access and other facets of rare disease and some of the challenges that are just inherent within that population. And we encourage Congress to look at that legislation as well. During today's fireside chat later this morning, Alexion Senior Vice President Scott Weintraub will dive deeper into some of the changes that are needed to help this community thrive. And I'm very much looking forward to that discussion along with some of the other panel topics that we have here today. Again, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Del. For our first session, we will hear from the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response, which manages government stockpiles of medical equipment, on how they're preparing for the next pandemic. Please welcome to the stage Dawn O'Connell, Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and to moderate, Sarah Overmall, Washington correspondent at STAT.
Oh, hi. Dawn, so glad to have you here, and especially everyone braving this rain this morning. I want to jump straight in talking about one of the several disease outbreaks or concerns that we're going to discuss, starting with H5N1. And so we had recent news in Missouri that there was another confirmed human case. There's questions about people who are exposed to them getting sick that we don't really have answers to. So I just wanted to ask, from your perspective, ASPR manages the stockpile, manages, therapies and or providing those to people. So where do you think we are right now in the federal response, both with providing those things to different states and communicating the risk to people?
Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah, so much for the question. And thank you all for having me here and for coming out on a rainy morning. So to start, H5N1 is a pandemic influenza, and we're seeing it circulate in the dairy cow herds in the United States. This is the first time we've seen that. I think we picked up the first case in a cow in March and have been watching very carefully as it's entered various herds, working closely with our USDA partners. The good news is at this point, the risk to humans remains low. The virus has stayed very clumsy when it has transmitted to humans from likely the milking equipment that the dairy workers came into contact with. And it has manifested itself as conjunctivitis or pink eye, and it's been extraordinarily manageable. We've also not seen it transmit from human to human, which would be one of those indications that we are starting to see some evolution in the virus becoming less clumsy. So just to level set, so far, risk to humans appears low, but we are extraordinarily watchful because if one of these took hold and began to transmit from humans to humans, we could lose control of it very, very quickly. In 2018, we celebrated the 100-year, not celebrated, but maybe marked the 100-year anniversary of the Spanish flu, a highly virulent flu. And at that point, any number of experts who were sitting in this chair, like I am today, would have said, we're due for another highly virulent flu. And when it comes, it has it could spread across the country and cause significant loss of life very quickly. So we have been watchful ever since. Turned out it was a coronavirus that hit in 2020, and we were able to pivot very quickly to manage that pandemic. But we are, anticipating that there would be a virulent flu that would hit again, and we need to be ready for that. So where does ASPR fit in? We are the organization within the federal government. As Sarah mentioned, we run the Strategic National Stockpile. We also coordinate the department's responses to any of these public health emergencies or disasters. And disasters is also part of that. So just to say, we've got some teams deployed right now in advance of Hurricane Helene making landfall in Florida. We've got some clinical teams ready to go. So we manage all hazards when it comes to providing the medical and public health care in response. So we have the Strategic National Stockpile. So one of our jobs is to make sure the country has the tools it needs to respond to anything that we see happening. And in the course of H5, we've been able to make PPE, personal protective equipment, that we stockpiled as a result of COVID-19. We've been able to make it available to the states that are currently impacted, that are seeing H5 in their dairy cows, so their dairy workers will be protected. We have also been able to distribute Tamiflu, which currently is what CDC recommends for treatment when H5 is in a human. And the stockpile has had, because we've always worried about a highly virulent flu, has stores of Tamiflu available. We've made that. So we've done some distribution of tools. We also have the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority within ASPR, BARDA. And BARDA's role is to look across the threat landscape and make sure that we are developing the vaccines, the therapies, the diagnostics that we might need. And they've maintained, because we've always been concerned about a highly virulent flu, a storage of adjuvants, antigens, and manufacturing capability to be able to, whatever flu seems to be, what pandemic flu is circulating, they can find and piece together a vaccine fairly quickly that would be responsive to that flu. So we currently have in our fill finish capacity in our vials about 4 million doses of a vaccine that we anticipate will be well matched against H5. And we will be prepared to deploy that if we need it. Again, we're not seeing that we need that, but we're prepared to deploy that. We also have invested in creating an mRNA vaccine for H5. Right now, as successful as mRNA was in COVID, that's the only indication that FDA has given for an mRNA vaccine. We only have one license for COVID. So we're trying to, but because we're able to manufacture it so quickly based on the technology, having that available for other things that might come is really important innovation for us. So we've invested in a program to try to bring mRNA technology to pandemic flu viruses. More to come there. We announced a partnership with Moderna this summer, and we have more announcements coming.
Comprehensive. No. And you also laid out what BARDA is, which helps me because we are going to get to BARDA. But just right quick before that, on H5N1 and the stockpile in particular, you did say you have been making protective gear available. Are states, are farms taking you up on that? And, how has that changed since, because it's now since the spring all the way through the summer, are people still asking for that? Has there been a rise in demand?
So we continue to see new herds identified. California was the most recent, and we've sent 4 shipments of PPE to California. So states that are wanting to be prepared to make sure that they have what they need to protect their dairy workers continue to reach out. We've made PPE available to about 12 states at this point. Now, we're in a different position than in 2020. People do have access in the commercial market, and many are buying it themselves, and we encourage that. But we want to be a backstop for those that can't find what they need, so we don't risk additional spread.
Okay, moving to Mpox now. There's an outbreak in Africa, and HHS has been supporting partners there with vaccines and other supplies. And recently at an event about Mpox, HHS's Assistant Secretary of Global Affairs, Lois Pace, said there are innovation engines at HHS, and she made clear that she was referring to ASPR and BARDA. They are not funded to develop innovations for Mpox. The vaccines we're using are for smallpox. And she went on to talk about, some of why that is. So I want to ask, first what your take is on that situation with Mpox, and then what would be the funding mechanisms and authorities that would fix that problem?
Thank you for that question. That is absolutely right. So first of all, to Mpox, we're watching very carefully. In 2022, we saw the outbreak of what we call Clade 2, which was being spread through sexual contact, mostly in the men who have sex with men community. And we targeted, and we were able to, because we had investments in smallpox vaccine, we were able to make the Jynneos vaccine available at the time to try to slow the spread of Mpox in the United States. But the reason why we had the smallpox vaccine is because as ASPR was stood up, after the PAPA bill in 2025, we were tasked with looking at and developing countermeasures against chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats. This was in the post 9/11 era when we were really focused on some of the intentional threats that might occur on our homeland. So smallpox was one of the things that we were extraordinarily worried about at the time. And they tied our Project BioShield money. So when we were established, we were given a line of funding called Project BioShield. But we cannot spend money from Project BioShield unless the Department of Homeland Security has indicated that there is a material threat for that, that it is a material threat to the homeland. And if they've given that what we call an MTD, a material threat determination, then we can spend money. It turns out that we had a series of material threat determinations in 2004, 2005, 2006, just as this was standing up. And until COVID, we had not had another biological material threat determination issued since 2006. So the list of material threat determinations has not kept up with the risk that we're seeing. And right now, we only have a material threat determination to work on smallpox. We do not have one to work on mpox. So during the height of the acute response in 2022 here in the United States, we worked with our partners across the interagency, and they all agreed that rather than hang on to some of these vaccines for smallpox, make them available for mpox, because that was the issue at hand and what we needed it for. But the reality is, even though we asked Congress, we've never gotten reimbursed for that. And so we are in the process of rebuilding those stores that we made available from our smallpox storage and continuing to work with the Department of Homeland Security on what new material threat determinations need to be added so we can actually be more prepared for what we're seeing.
I do want to get to Congress now and what you are asking for them and how it's going. Earlier this year, Republicans on the Energy and Commerce Committee wrote that ASPR had a, quote, lack of appropriate planning and urgency managing the stockpile. And Congress also separately rescinded a good amount of money, not just from ASPR, but other parts of HHS that were tied to the coronavirus emergency. So where would you say right now those conversations are, particularly with people like the Republicans who've said that you didn't manage the stockpile correctly? And you mentioned PAPA, that's the Pandemic All Hazards Preparedness Act, which is up for reauthorization. Can you give us just insight on how that relationship with Congress is right now?
So we remain extraordinarily grateful for our congressional colleagues on both sides of the aisle. In the markup of the labor HHS bill on the House side, the only organization within HHS that received an increase, small as it was ASPR. So that shows me that even though there are some questions, and I do want to talk about the SNS in a second, that there are some questions about some of these programs that we're managing through, they have extraordinary confidence in our ability to deliver. The country has access to the Jynneos vaccine for mpox because BARDA invested in it. The country has access to vaccines for COVID and any number of other, the H5, as we talked about, because we've invested in it, procured it, distributed it when needed. And I think Congress sees that and they understand the value add. On the Senate side, Mark, 2 organizations received budget increases in their markup. One was NIH, which anyone here who's worked in the NIH space would expect, and the other was ASPR. So I continue to think both sides of the both sides of the Capitol, both the Senate and the House, seem to understand the work that we're doing. But that's not to say everything's been perfect. So I do want to talk a little bit about the SNS. So the SNS was founded, and this is actually its 25th year. So it was founded in 1999 and was situated in CDC for many years until 2018. And then Congress made the decision to move it over to ASPR. And I'm really glad that they did. And they did that because we've got BARDA. So we've got the organization that's looking across the landscape and deciding the threats and then developing the vaccines and therapies, diagnostics that we need to be prepared. And then the SNS's responsibility is to pick up what BARDA has developed successfully and stockpile it. So we have it in the country available to be used against whatever threat we see. Well, when those 2 organizations were sitting in different parts of the department, they were not connected. So the leadership in each organization was, distant from the various programs in the other and couldn't look across the whole landscape to make sure that the budgets were equivalent. So what we ended up seeing, and I'm extraordinarily grateful, BARDA's budget kept going up because people, they were delivering, they were getting these vaccines and these therapies ready to go. Jynneos, an example of that. The SNS was, buried deep into the CDC organization, was only opened on our worst days. It was not kept, in a useful posture, though it did onesies, twosies as needed. It was not widely called on regularly. And so it fell out of view, and its budget was not able to keep up. So here you've got BARDA developing all of these vaccines and therapeutics, and then the SNS not having the equivalent budget to take them and to stockpile them. And the stockpiling part is really important because it requires not only the initial purchase of the vaccine or therapeutic, but the maintenance of those vaccines and therapies, either through a vendor-managed inventory contract or on our stockpile shelves. And that gets to be extraordinarily expensive. So I've been able to, in the course of my tenure, now having them both under the same roof, is let Congress know how important it is to have them both be equal, have them keep up with each other. I mean, there are always going to be advanced research and development costs that are different than the SNS costs and vice versa. So they're never going to be on, the exact same number, but they should be on par with each other and heading in the right direction so the continuum works. And when I got in the seat, the continuum was broken. BARDA was developing all these wonderful things. The SNS couldn't afford to stockpile them. So among the things that I've done is I've moved the SNS, and it is now its own center in ASPR. The leader of the SNS reports directly to me, and I and he meet weekly to make sure that we are watching all of the things that need to happen. Not only that, I've ensured that the SNS is not just opened on our worst day, but that the muscle memory needed to be responsive to keep the country prepared is exercised regularly. That's why we are making PPE that we purchased for COVID available for H5. The SNS needs to know and remember what it means to be responsive, and states and communities need to know how to access it. So I think those were some of the criticisms that we received. And we are working very hard to manage through those and to strengthen the SNS. So it is that resource that we all can rely on when we need it.
So what I'm hearing is that the SNS is in a new era. ASPR itself is in somewhat of a new era. But, several advocates or allies, you could say, for pandemic preparedness are retiring from Congress. Regardless of the outcome of the election in a month, we will have a new president. So how much of this is, cemented when there is a new administration, when the Biden administration ends and Congress looks new?
So one of the critical things we've done in my tenure is we moved ASPR from a staff division. This is a little bit of inside baseball within HHS, but it was a staff division which was part of the Office of the Secretary. And the staff divisions within the Office of the Secretary, work on behalf of the department. You have the Office of General Counsel. They provide legal services for the department. You have the press office. They provide media and communication services for the department. So the staff divisions provide services on behalf of the larger department. The agencies, the operating divisions, run the nationwide programs. And ASPR always sat sort of as a hybrid, but was defined as a staff division. As a staff division, ASPR needed to wait in line behind our ledge office, behind our communications office, behind whoever was in line in front of us to hire anybody. We relied on the department's infrastructure for our hiring, for our acquisitions. So we were, as coming out of COVID, one of the first things that I was able to identify was that we needed to have those own capabilities as a response organization unique to us. The needs of our ledge shop, as important as those are different when it comes to hiring than I have in the middle of a response. And we had, in order to do surge staffing in COVID, prior to my getting here, we had to rely on FEMA and other adjacent sister agencies to help staff us up because they could move quicker. We had to rely on DOD to do assisted acquisitions because we didn't have the authorities we needed to move the money as quickly as possible. By becoming an operating division, which the secretary agreed to, decided and signed off on for us in 2022, allows us to build these capabilities ourselves. So we can be a strong, functioning emergency response organization that takes care of our own needs, particularly in times of emergency.
I want to wrap by citing something that's actually said a lot in military circles, that generals always fight the last war. And I can see how that could apply in emergency healthcare preparedness, because we could be thinking about the next COVID when actually what is next is unimaginable to us. So how do you make sure not to depend too much on what we last saw in preparing for the next? And also, what sort of is the war, if you will, that scares you most in healthcare preparedness?
Sarah is always so good at asking questions. So that's exactly right. I mean, you heard me say in 2018, everyone was predicting another 100-year flu. And in 2020, a coronavirus hit. We have to be nimble, prepared, always looking forward. And that was one of the things that worried me most when I came into this role in 2021. How do I anticipate and prepare for that thing that I don't know? We get used to what we've just been through. And so we watch the front door while that thing that we're not expecting slides in the window. How am I sure that I've got my windows shut too? And one of the neat innovations that our BARDA team has been doing is they've been working on threat agnostic countermeasures, which treat the injury that the threat causes and not just the source of the threat. So for years, they've been one bug, one drug. And that made a lot of sense when we were just limited to those man-made chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear threats coming out of September 11th. We could anticipate anthrax, smallpox, a potential radiological nuclear event. So they were working on countermeasures directed specifically to those threats. But if you take a step back and see where we are in 2024 and look across the range with climate change and other factors, the interconnected world we live in, things that used to never make it to our shores make it to our shores every day. How are we protecting ourselves against that? And BARD has begun this initiative to really look at, okay, in a respiratory virus, no matter what the virus is that's causing it, you are going to have these injuries. And we need to have countermeasures that protect people from those injuries and treat those injuries, as opposed to worrying about what the source is. So in addition to, and they'll always continue to have very targeted countermeasures to the highest threats we see, they are also creating some flexibility for us to be able to have a range of countermeasures that would apply to just about anything we can anticipate. So I'm hoping that's one of the ways that we're able to stay flexible, but I'm always open to suggestions.
But the second part of that, what's your nightmare healthcare emergency?
So I think probably one of the big, thank you, Sarah. So good. Well, I mean, we are seeing these, diseases come fast and furious. They're much more intense and much more frequent than they were before. At the same time, we're seeing the oceans heating up, and those sorts of disasters landing faster and more frequently. We used to have a hurricane season. Now we just have the year in which hurricanes can come at any point. So I think my biggest worry is not the disease X, because we're working on platform technology. We're working on these threat agnostic. And we know that even if we haven't nailed it, we can get there quickly, like we did with COVID, because we had done the MERS work. We were already ready and able to pivot very quickly to another coronavirus, which was COVID. But the biggest worry is what FEMA deals with all the time, which is the poly crisis. What happens when two hurricanes are coming up different oceans at the same time? We see the first case of Clade 1 Mpox hit our shores at the same time that all of a sudden the H5 breaks loose and breaks open wide in humans. And then we have, whatever the regular seasonal flu season is. If we begin to see all of these things happening at once, we will be extraordinarily strained in our ability to respond.
Not to close on that note, but I think we are out of time, and I think it explains the importance of the agency. So thank you so much for doing this. Appreciate having you here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah and Dawn, for that great conversation. Up next, we have a conversation with our presenting sponsor, Scott Weintraub, Senior Vice President of U.S. Business at Alexion AstraZeneca Rare Disease, and to moderate, Stat's Executive Editor, Rick Burke.
So why don't we get right into it? We have 10 quick minutes, and I want to make the most of it, and you do too. So tell me first about Alexion's role in this. Where does Alexion, it's clearly a behemoth in rare disease, in the rare disease space, but where do you fit in?
Great. Thank you, Rick. So Alexion's 30 years old. We have celebrated our 30th anniversary last year. I think Dale mentioned in his opening remarks, the Orphan Drug Act is 40 years old. And so it strikes me is that there's probably not going to be a company fully developing in rare disease that's over 40 years old. Shows you the success of the policy of the Orphan Drug Act as it was intended to spur innovation in that space. So we are a fully integrated research, development, and commercialization company only focused on rare disease. As Del mentioned, our history was really based off of the complement cascade, which is understanding autoimmunity and how the body attacks itself. And understanding that cascade allowed us to develop therapies that actually worked across a number of therapeutic areas that are implemented by autoimmune disease. So we've got a singular drug that's actually approved in hematology, nephrology, as well as neurodegenerative and neuromuscular. And we have other drugs in the bone, metabolic, as well as cardiovascular area. But that idea of a singular drug that can work across many different disease states is going to be an important theme as we talk about the Inflation Reduction Act and the Orphan Cures Act. Last thing I would say, what I think makes Alexion unique is this fully integrated nature of a rare disease company. A lot of small biotechs can do research or maybe get to late stage development. But at Alexion, we're very heavily focused on almost a mission to get our medicines to patients around the globe living with rare disease, which is not easy because a lot of countries around the globe don't have rare disease policies, don't have an infrastructure for small patient populations. And what we try and do is help develop those policies largely based off what the US policies have been to be able to get our drugs around the globe. So I think we're in a unique position as a leader to push for policies for rare disease patients, whether it's in the US or around the globe.
And before we get into the policies themselves and what's working, what's not, can you talk a little bit about your remit? You have more than 1,000 people you oversee in the US. Just how that works, what you do every day.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great pleasure to work with these folks. Rare disease is unique in terms of to be successful, it really takes like putting a puzzle together. So we have sales, medical affairs, market access, patient services, which is heavily important in a place like a rare disease company, market access. So everything that touches the rare disease patient population and their caregivers to give them access to their medicine sits within one team that I lead within the US organization. I also uniquely actually started my career at AstraZeneca over 20 years ago, pre the Pascal days. And we came back in with the acquisition of Alexion. I had been there. So have a little bit of before and after in terms of what that looks like. But it's a great pleasure to be focused on the rare disease patients.
Just one quick question that we didn't talk about. What culturally, what's it like before and after? Does it feel like a different workplace?
Yeah, I think the commitment to scientific innovation and the global footprint to maximize the reach of our medicines is just palpable throughout. So we obviously have a huge oncology business unit, what we call biopharmaceuticals, and now rare disease. But across a common thread across that is how do you reach more patients regardless of where they're at? And different business units have different needs. In rare disease, you're actually building policies at the same time you're trying to get your medicines out to patients.
Now, Del gave a good sort of contextual overview of some of what you all are facing. And one of the things he said was the Inflation Reduction Act takes us backwards. Can you talk a little more about that and what the concerns are and what needs to change as far as you're concerned?
Yeah, there's a lot into the Inflation Reduction Act, but in particular, we're focused on one particular area, which we call the orphan drug exemption. What this exemption says is basically you're exempt from Medicare negotiations if you're approved for a singular orphan disease. And as I mentioned earlier, it is not unusual to have drugs in this space that are actually approved for multiple rare diseases. And the reason this is important, I think people know drug development in and of itself is a very difficult proposition, regardless of the disease you're going after. And things like having translational models, understanding endpoints, understanding how many patients you have to enroll into study to see that endpoint move, come to an agreement with regulators that that endpoint's acceptable evidence of an approval. When you take into consideration rare disease, all of those things are less well known. There's lots of times there's no translational medicine. There's no other approved drugs in that space. Nobody knows how many patients you may need to enroll to see movement on an endpoint, even if you come to an agreement with the endpoint. So everything is just much harder in rare versus traditional drug development. One of the things that you can do to reduce risk is take an approved asset that has cleared the hurdle of safe and effective. You know that it's hit a target that it was meant to hit, and look for other indications of high unmet medical need to develop that drug. And what the Inflation Reduction Act says is we're going to actually take away an incentive for you to do that. So you actually lose the incentive to reduce your risk to bring your drug to many more patients around the globe. And you're seeing this having a real impact today. You see announcements and financial updates where companies are not developing in certain smaller, less prevalent indications. And I like to give one example from Alexion with a drug called Soliris. Its first approved indication was in 2007 for an indication called PNH. This is where you wake up one morning and if you go to the restroom, your urine would be black. You would have severe abdominal pain, your fatigue would be overwhelming, and these patients would die 15, 20 years earlier than healthy norms. And that was before Soliris was approved. After Soliris was approved, these patients live full lives in terms of healthy, normal people. More than a decade later, Soliris got its last indication for a neurodegenerative disease called NMOSD. This happens largely in female, a lot of times in African and Asian heritage, have higher prevalences, more severe disease. And you could be a woman in their 40s, caregiver for children, caregiver for your parents, and you wake up blind and or paralysis. You basically are having your CNS attacked from an autoimmune disease. And Soliris actually prevents these relapse almost at 100% rate. So if a patient starts taking Soliris, you may never have another relapse again. So those two indications, two different scientific areas, develop more than 10 years apart. And so if you think about the Inflation Reduction Act, you have to think, what would be a rational choice for a company to make? Would you wait to have all these indications, denying PNH patients your drug as soon as possible? Or what would happen a lot is you may never get an agreement to develop in NMOSD this drug that has significantly benefited patients. And so these are terrible choices for the rare disease patient community and something we want to find a solution for in the Orphan Cures Act.
So what has to happen to change that? Is it the CARES, the act, what has to happen?
Yeah, so right now there's a bipartisan piece of legislation in Congress called the Orphan Cures Act. And what this does, it's narrowly focused on that orphan drug exemption. It basically says a company who continues to develop a drug in rare diseases, whether more than 1, 2, 3, that you can stay exempt. It basically restores the intent of the Orphan Drug Act that the IRA ate away at a little bit, and keeps the incentive for companies to continue to develop in that orphan drug space. It also clarifies the timing of when a clock would start. You wouldn't want that clock to go back to the original indication, again, diminishing a company's desire to develop the second indication. So it confirms that clock, but really just restores the incentives to continue drug development and innovation in the rare disease space. It's incredibly important that passes. And it's a bipartisan. And you see it in conversations with congressmen. People who've been touched by rare disease get the issue quickly and are very supportive of the idea.
What's your sense of those who haven't, members of Congress who haven't been touched by rare disease? What are you trying to, how much convincing do they need? Like, do they understand what's at stake as far as you're concerned?
Yeah, I think when we can get in front of them and explain the issue, I think it's intuitive to them that this is something that will benefit rare disease patients, but we have to get to more of them. There's a Save Rare Treatments Task Force, which we're a part of, but it's a partnership with other companies in the industry, a lot of patient groups, a lot of policymakers. And so continuing this education element, bringing these patient stories to life for the congressman, because it's not a partisan issue. There's nothing more inequitable than giving a rare disease, and it affects political parties and families across the country. And so making that real to them, I'm not quite sure anything's going to pass the remainder of this year, but we'll keep up that work. And certainly, if there's anyone interested here to be part of that Save Rare Treatments Task Force, please reach out because we think it's an important thing to help rare disease patients and their families.
Scott, thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you to Scott and Rick. For our next session, we'll take a look inside the Senate and what's possible this year ahead of the upcoming election. Please welcome to the stage Senator Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire, and to moderate, Rachel Korshang, Chief Washington Correspondent at STAT.
All right. Well, hello, Senator. Thanks so much for being here. We are so excited to have you.
Good morning. It's great to be here on a rainy Washington morning.
It is indeed. So let's just jump right in. We have so much to talk about. Sure. First, I know we're kind of facing down this deadline at the end of December, where I think there is an opportunity for some healthcare legislation to pass. What's your number one ask in that package on healthcare?
Wow. I always try to avoid a number one anything. I feel like I'm singling out a child or something. But I will say that we do have bipartisan opportunities to pass critical legislation that strengthens the healthcare system. We know we have to attend to our community health centers. We know we have to reauthorize the Support Act, which if I were to pick something that is most pressing, that may be one of the items there. As you all know, the Support Act was a historic investment in countering the opioid epidemic. We have really good news this last week that for the first time in a long time, we're seeing a decrease in opioid overdose deaths in the country, but it's still about 100,000 deaths a year, which is unacceptable. And, in a state like mine, which was hit very early and hard by the opioid and then fentanyl epidemic, this is still a major, major concern. A constituent came up to me recently. She's a teacher in the Manchester schools. She lost 3 brothers to the opioid epidemic. That is not, losing multiple family members is not an uncommon story in New Hampshire. And so the Support Act remains really important because it invests in the whole network of prevention, treatment, and recovery resources. We did get one aspect of the Support Act already passed into law, which was to make permanent the requirement that Medicaid cover opioid treatment. And then I'm not sure we'll need to put it into an end-of-the-year package, but we successfully passed the MAT Act, Medication Assisted Treatment Act, and that's been a really important removal of a barrier to medication-assisted treatment, but we have to help more doctors get trained up in how to do medication-assisted treatment and integrate addiction treatment into their practice. And then, as you know, I'm also working on site neutrality, working on a number of bills that would help us get more generics to market more quickly and find other ways to save the overall system money, make sure patients have access to care, strengthen our rural healthcare, and strengthen maternal healthcare. So those are some of the priorities writ large.
That's a long list. But let's talk about the Support Act briefly. What's the holdup there? Because it is bipartisan. It is still such a pressing issue for so many communities. Like, what's it going to take to get this done?
Oh, look, I think, first of all, what you saw is people coming together and getting pieces of it done. I think this is more just about finding a vehicle for it to ride on, right? Because we need to have a number of healthcare priorities reflected in an end of the year package. I was hoping we'd get some of that marked up this morning, but that's now not happening, but I assume it'll happen when we get back. But there is strong bipartisan support for it. And as you noted, the opioid crisis hits every family, every community, people from all walks of life. And we need, the other, I think, recognition we need to make, and people are still, I shouldn't say people, but I think the stigma around addiction still impacts the degree to which we are investing in treatment. And I think it's getting a lot better. We obviously, by passing the MAT Act, we've acknowledged that medication-assisted treatment is an appropriate and gold standard way of treating opioid addiction. We need to make access to methadone much easier, because for some people with addiction, methadone is the most appropriate treatment. And right now, people have to go to a methadone clinic to get it for treatment. And in rural America, this means that there are people who aren't getting the treatment they need because they'd have to drive a couple hours to get it. So that's another piece. But we ultimately need to integrate addiction treatment into regular primary care. And that's still a ways off.
Excellent. And I also wanted to touch on the other issue that you brought up, which was site neutral payments. For everybody, that's kind of the idea that Medicare should be paying the same amount for the same services, regardless of whether they're provided in a hospital outpatient department or a physician's offices. And Senator Hassan, you've led the SITE Act, which is the leading proposal on this issue in the Senate. But there has been some pushback. There have been some concerns from particularly Republican lawmakers about how that would affect rural hospitals. And I know Senator Cassidy, who leads who's the leading Republican on the HELP committee, has indicated that he thinks that current proposals might take too much money from hospitals. So are you willing to make some tweaks to that proposal to potentially get to some broader agreement?
Well, so Bill Cassidy, who's ranking on HELP, is a great friend and a great partner. And as you all know, we passed the Surprise Medical Billing Act together. And he and I are actually engaged with stakeholders right now around the Site Neutrality Act. But just to take a step back, this is what's happening in communities all across the country. I'm a patient. I go to my doctor on a regular basis. I have arthritis. I get a steroid injection every so often, and it costs whatever it costs. Let's say it costs $100. A hospital purchases that practice. I go for my next appointment, and all of a sudden I get a facility fee that can drive the cost of that steroid injection up to $1,000. And that's all just because of a financial transaction between a hospital and the physician practice. It has nothing to do with the change in the capacity of the physician practice, where I'm getting my treatment, the overhead that physician practice has nothing. And so just as we did in surprise medical bills, my perspective in the Site Neutrality Act is the patients. And that's always where I try to put myself in these discussions. And there is no reason that I met with constituents in New Hampshire recently who had gotten bills as large as $1,000 for a doctor's visit when they had no idea it was coming because of the facility fee. Insurers won't necessarily cover it. So patients are back into this, whose bill is it? On the issue of what the site neutrality bill would cost hospitals, it would save a lot of money in the healthcare system. It would save Medicare money. It would save patients money. Part of the site neutrality bill provides for taking the savings and investing them in workforce training, because hospitals and healthcare systems generally tell me we are really short on nurses and other healthcare professionals. And there are ways I think that we can get at the needs of rural hospitals in particular. We've got rural hospitals in New Hampshire too, who have expressed concerns. But it really, the whole debate about this bill really speaks to the fact that our system is incredibly opaque. And so hospitals have learned to deal with the system and invest in physician practices. They can charge facility fees that can increase their cash flow. I get it, but it's not a rational system. And if we can impose some transparency, and the House has already passed a piece of the Site Neutrality Act, which would just say all medical bills have to show where the care was provided, so we can begin to track what's happening to these costs. If we have transparency, then we can also really begin to understand what kind of payments our rural hospitals need in order to make sure that they can provide the care that's so essential to their communities.
So that's a great explanation. So let's talk about prescription drugs now. I know that's an issue that you've worked on for a long time. First, let's talk about PBM reform. So, pharmacy middlemen have been a topic of conversation this entire Congress. There's been so much legislation passed out of committee and even passed through the House of Representatives. Is December the time when we're going to see some action on PBM reform?
Well, I certainly hope so. And as you just noted, there is bipartisan support for PBM reform. Just taking a step back, what we were able to do in the Inflation Reduction Act is obviously lower the costs of certain prescription drugs, put in some parameters, the $35 cap on insulin for seniors. I literally, when I first told constituents that was coming in January, I was visiting with them in the fall. This couple got out a notepad and they began to redo their monthly budget. They were like, really? My insulin's only going to cost $35? And so I want, we obviously always want people to be able to get life-saving medication. They just shouldn't have to go bankrupt to get it. And so we did that. We've now gotten the results of the price negotiation between the government and the 10 drugs that were on their first list. Interesting thing is, in about half of those negotiations, the government accepted the drug company's last best offer, and about half the drug companies accepted the government's last best offer. So it seems like it has been a really good faith and legitimate set of negotiations. That's going to save individuals and our healthcare system billions of dollars. And we've also obviously put in the provision that says prices for drugs can't go up more than the cost of inflation. So we've made some progress. We have a lot more to do. PBMs, one of the things that has been very frustrating for a lot of us on both finance and health is that when we have leaders from pharmaceutical companies coming to us, they point to the PBMs. When the PBMs come in, they point to the pharmaceutical companies. We just had a nice breakthrough moment this week in health when Chair Sanders got the head of Novo Nordisk to acknowledge that he would sit down with the PBM leaders to see if they could reduce the price of Ozempic and Wegovy without it dropping off the PBM's formularies. So I think we're making some progress there. The other area that I want to focus on is making sure we can get generics to market more quickly. And I've got a couple of bills that we've gotten to bipartisan agreement on in help that will help us do that.
And you also have legislation that was supposed to be marked up today on patents, right?
Yeah.
And so it seems like there's a lot of activity in different panels, like different committees across the Senate on patent reform. Is that like an orchestrated effort here to try to get some sort of patent bill ready?
Well, so the patent piece I'm really focused on is really also another way to get generics to market, right? So one of the things I have focused on, if there's a coordinated effort, it's looking at what drives prescription drug prices up. I had one pharmaceutical company in front of me one time, and I said, well, how many new patent applications do you have for this one drug that's already been around for a long time? And he said, I don't know, a couple. It was 168. And because they can find little tiny changes in the use for the drug or the composition of the drug, and then apply for a new patent and keep the exclusivity going for another decade. So what my patent bill does is essentially says that when a pharmaceutical company provides information to the FDA about the composition of the drug that they're applying to have approved, and they apply for a patent for it, the information that is material to patentability has to be the same to the FDA and the patent company. Because here's what's been happening. They tell the FDA, here's everything, here's the composition of the drug in great detail. They don't give the same information to the patent office. 10 years later, when a generic could come in because their exclusivity is gone, they then go back to the patent office and give the information that they gave the FDA a decade ago and say it's actually slightly different now. We want exclusivity for another 10 years. So that's what my bill would eliminate. The other bill that I have is right now the FDA is allowed to it's allowed to tell a generic company that they've got the right they've got the right ingredients for the drug, but they can't. Let's say you need 5% more of one of the ingredients to match what the brand name is. The FDA can't tell you you're off by 5%. They can just tell you you're off. Then you have to guess again, and it delays another 6 months before you can reapply. I think that the FDA should be able to say, yeah, you've got all the right ingredients. You need to bump up that ingredient by 5%, and now you can bring your generic to market much faster. So both of those bills are intended to just stop the gamesmanship around patents and around exclusivity and get generics to market more quickly, because we know that lowers the costs.
Rachel, if you're ready for an audience question, we have one over here.
Okay. I have one more question.
Okay.
We'll pop over there. I just wanted to briefly talk about your work on United Health following the Change Healthcare cyber attack. I know you've been really involved in oversight on that issue. And so if you could just give us an update on where you're at and if you feel like United is cooperating appropriately with congressional efforts on this.
I was really surprised. Maybe I'll put it this way. It seemed to me that United was really caught off guard by this attack. And that surprised me because no company, organization that provides critical services in a huge sector of our economy should be unprepared as they were for this kind of cyber attack. So we had early on some relatively constructive conversations with them, but we did have to push. A number of our hospitals in New Hampshire were really impacted, as some of them saw their revenues drop 98% in the first few weeks after this. And we really had to push, I thought, harder than we should have to get United to step up and really take ownership of the attack. Since then, it's also been very frustrating that they have not provided the kind of notification to individuals about the possibility of personal identifying information having been breached. So we have a ways to go to make sure that companies like United are thinking ahead, planning ahead, have the kind of cybersecurity in place that they should have. And that if something happens, that they are prepared to really work quickly to help the healthcare community. There is a bipartisan cybersecurity group working right now to try to figure out what, in fact, we should expect from these very, very large healthcare companies that control so much of our healthcare market. One of the advantages of a large consolidated entity like United is, the scale the economies of scale that they can provide, the data analysis they can provide. But it also means that when there is a cyber attack against an entity that large, that it really impacts, millions and millions of people and a lot of our healthcare sector. So there's more work to do.
So much. All right, we'll go to the audience question over here.
Hi. First off, thank you so much, Senator Hassan, for being here today and the STAT team holding. My name is Angela Mariam from Capstone. My question for you is, I know there are a lot of priorities that are expiring at the end of the year, including telehealth, also talks of PFS fix, SALSA PAMA, et cetera. And I know a number of pay-fors have been introduced to pay for these extensions like site neutrality, patent reform, PBM reform, and a repeal of this skilled nursing facility staffing mandate. how do you think of the end of year package in terms of what priorities get incorporated, and how do you think of the offsets that would be used to pay for such priorities? Thank you.
I think some of this isn't really predictable until we get through the election, get to the other side, have the markup that we were supposed to have today, and really kind of get a sense of where our savings are, where our investments need to be. I will tell you that there is a lot of attention on telehealth. It's obviously been a huge, huge asset that we thought was kind of a necessary not evil, but a necessary thing during the pandemic. And all of a sudden we discovered how incredibly effective and useful it is. And so I think there is a lot of bipartisan interest in addressing, extending telehealth. We obviously have to deal with our community health center funding and extensions. And then that means the pay-fors like PBM reform and site neutrality are going to be top of mind for a lot of people, and other savings where we can. But I would say Telehealth Support Act, community health centers are obviously real priorities, and the pay-fors that we've talked about, we're going to just have to find our way to yes on some of them so that we can do what we need to do to, physician payment is obviously the other piece of reform that's on everybody's mind.
Thanks so much for joining us, Senator.
Thank you very much. Great to see you all this morning.
Thank you, Rachel and Senator Hassan, for that great discussion. For our last session of the morning, we are going to bring the STAT Washington team upstage to talk about the upcoming election. Please welcome to the stage Sarah Overmall, Washington correspondent at STAT, Rachel Korjang, Chief Washington correspondent at STAT, John Wilkerson, Washington correspondent at STAT, and to moderate, Rick Burke, STAT co-founder and executive editor. We will also be welcoming audience questions during this time if there's anything you would like to ask our reporters. Thank you.
Now that the senator has left the room, so why don't we get right into it? Rachel, what did she make news? What surprised you?
I think she, especially on site neutral payment, she did seem to express some openness to making accommodations for rural hospitals. So we'll have to see. I think that, policy may be a few years down the line, but I think that, she was at least willing to engage with that conversation. And I think, obviously her work on United Health and change in the cyber attack, I think is going to be a really interesting thread to follow in the future as, these senators get together and put their heads together and decide whether there is a role for more active oversight on this issue.
Sarah, let's go to you. And Don O'Connell, what struck you as newsy or surprising?
Well, I think two things, although I wouldn't say it was surprising how forcefully she responded to Republican criticism of the stockpile management, but it was interesting. She has a lot of reason to be defensive on that because, we are in the midst of budget talks, and she's noted that she thinks they're in a good place there. But there is, appetite for accountability with how the stockpile is being managed, where they're putting money, what type of technology they're investing in. She brought up mRNA vaccines and the possibility there for other diseases. But I think there could be continued questions about how that money is being spent and how the stockpile is being fixed. And she did acknowledge it needed fixing. I think the other thing really quickly would just be that I definitely found it interesting how when describing what the poly crisis nightmare scenario would be, how close we are to that. She brought up, say we're in a hurricane season and a flu season and H5N1 keeps transmitting to people. And I'm like, that's like next week. So that was interesting to me too.
John, is there anything our colleagues are leaving out that you think is worth mentioning from the earlier sessions?
No, I also picked up on the fact that Senator Hassan is open to negotiation, it seems. She didn't outright say that, but she made pretty clear that she's talking to Senator Cassidy, and she's willing to find a way to address some of those concerns about rural hospitals and not just, block his she's willing to work with them. Yeah, I think there will be changes to that bill, and I think that's important to watch.
I'd like to go inside a little bit and have the three of you talk a little bit about how you do your jobs every day, and how I said at the outset, we like to do exclusive stories that no one else is doing. How do you produce and pursue those stories? Starting with Rachel, and if you could also add in there sort of what you're going to be doing as we approach the election, and sort of what you're going to be looking for, the types of coverage and stories.
So on the first question, I think how we find exclusive stories, I think honestly it starts with relationships, just like so much in this town. And I think I find that my reporting is at its best when I'm actively having conversations with people, when I'm on the phone, mingling in rooms just like this, and somebody will mention, a little tidbit that I can follow up on. And I mean, just last morning I was at an event and John and I were working together to confirm some news about the new CEO of the generics lobby. And it's about building those relationships so that there are people to text, when those things come through. And then I'm just making sure that we're verifying everything and just being so careful. So truly, I think just having conversations with people and stat readers and fans are just truly the most important part of that process. And I think for going into the election, I think our focus through this whole process has been trying to lay out the stakes for healthcare policy. And, sometimes that's a moving target, but we're just trying to do the best we can to explain on the different issues, what we do know, what we don't know, and help people make the best choices for themselves, and help kind of give some context, because healthcare is complicated. And the issues that these candidates are talking about, are really complicated things. So we're trying to help people understand those issues better. That's obviously going to be one area of focus. And another is just how the healthcare system is kind of influencing the election as well, and whether they're getting engaged and to what degree, and just kind of how they see the stakes for their industries as well.
Yeah, I can really only echo the first part, what Rachel said about relationships with people, and especially having those in-person or over phone talks, and not necessarily doing that for a specific reason at that time, but just catching up. And then you might find something interesting there. And, of course, as she said, we like to have those pretty consistently with people who are in the industries that we cover, people in Congress. But then also you have to keep in mind, the cast of characters that could be returning in another administration, and who they are, and where they are right now, and what they're doing. And then in terms of what we're thinking of leading up to the election, like Rachel said, a lot of it is explaining what these candidates are talking about. A lot of it too is explaining almost a reality check of what they actually can do. Like Rachel had a great story about Vice President Harris promising to clear medical debt, like how that would actually work. And from my end, a lot of what I'm covering right now is reproductive health care and rights. And so there's a lot of looking at what they are saying they both intend to do, and what they actually can do on that front.
John, you practically live on the Hill when Congress is in session. Could you talk a little bit about your strategy of getting stories?
It's no different than theirs. I like to talk to people. Call me anytime if you'd like. If there's anything you think we should be writing about. And on Capitol Hill, I mean, it's tough to say. One of the good things about being in Washington is that we have access that others don't. Not to get off on a completely different subject, but a lot of people worry that journalism, in addition to all the pressures that we're facing, that artificial intelligence will write our stories. But I do think that artificial intelligence will never be able to go up to a lawmaker and talk to them. And that kind of access and, honestly, just constant pestering is what works for us. A lot of the times I'll be standing next to another reporter in the hallway, and I'll ask her, who are you going to target today? What are you going to ask? And she'll say, oh, I don't know. I'm just going to find somebody and poke them, and you just almost need to go up to them and just think of something at the last second, something that they've been involved in. And bring it up and let them start talking. And then if you've been around long enough and have that, the context for what they're talking about, you can then ask more questions. And then it often turns into a story, or you learn a little something that fits into another story. Who knows?
It really is the very best way to cover Washington is grabbing lawmakers. It's just it's the way to do it. And let me just ask you before we go to questions, the opposite of that, it's always traditionally harder to penetrate the White House. And I'm curious, I asked our colleagues to do a piece on who are the most important people advising Trump on health policy. And that was a slippery one to get. So, and it's also not been easy with Biden or with Harris. Can you just talk for a second about access on stories to presidential candidates?
Yeah, Sarah, do you want to start? Yeah.
No, it isn't easy. And that's when I was referring to a potentially returning cast of characters. It's a bit of that because you look at, with Trump first, people who are in his first administration, people who might come back in a second, people who definitely wouldn't come back and why. And then with Harris, it's a similar, if slightly different set of questions. Are Biden people coming over from his administration into hers? Are Obama people, are people from her time in California? And thinking about, who she's brought along on some of these issues. I think one of the challenges with both of them is that for now, even though they have been talking a lot about certain healthcare, like Medicare reform, abortion rights, et cetera, that they haven't really staffed up just yet on who the specific people are who are going to be architects there. It's definitely something that we're thinking about.
Certainly. And I would just add that I think it's helpful for us to understand the relationships of people going in as well. And I think especially with, I think, for example, President Trump's campaign, I think there are just so many different ways, public health agencies could go depending on who he puts in there. So I think for us, it's understanding the outside groups as well, all the relationships that these people have cultivated over their decades in Washington and who they turn to, what they're reading, and really making sure that we can just understand kind of what they're hearing and who they're going to when they're trying to make these big decisions in the White House. So I think certainly we don't necessarily run up to them in the hallways in the same way, but there are other ways to understand what they're thinking.
Why don't we go to questions?
Good morning. I'm Justine Handelman with Handelman Strategies. Thank you all for your reporting. It's just very important. So question I have is around the Affordable Care Act. And there are these enhanced subsidies that were put in place at the start of the pandemic and extended once in the IRA that have led to record enrollment, more people insured than ever before, the lowest uninsured rate. Unfortunately, the ACA is still political, as we're seeing in this campaign, but the timeline is really tight to get them done because even though they expire at the end of 2025, insurers are developing rates and products. Open enrollment begins in November, of 2024. How do you see this getting extended, and does it? Is there a lame duck play? What happens next year on the timeline? New Congress, new president, always a slow start in getting legislation done. Would love your outlook.
Yeah, I will say Congress is never an institution to do anything early. So I would temper your expectations on that. But also, I think we are having this, obviously the big next legislative conversation we're going to be having is about taxes. And I think the subsidies are obviously a tax policy. And I think it's going to be absolutely critical to see what the balance of power is following this election in the Senate and the White House, in the House of Representatives, and how much leverage Democrats have to make the argument that these subsidies should be extended. They're politically they're complicated because a lot of the states that benefit the most are run by Republicans. And so I think what I've been hearing from staff is that I think there could be, potentially narrower extension, that they're not extended in the exact same terms that they are right now. We could see those narrow down somewhat, depending on, how much leverage they have, how much it costs, all of these different factors. But I would, at least from what we're hearing right now, wouldn't see those as a lame duck issue. But I don't know if anyone else has anything you'd like to add.
Yeah, and I would also point out that since they are taxes, I believe this is the kind of thing that can be handled on budget reconciliation. And I don't even want to get into that. I don't understand reconciliation rules. I will never understand reconciliation rules, but suffice it to say that both the premium subsidies and an extension of the tax cuts from 2017, each on their own would be enormously expensive. Together, they're crazy expensive, and you're going to probably have to at least partially pay for it. And Medicaid, I think, is out there as like an exposed thing because Medicaid is a spending program. I am in no way predicting that Congress is going to offset all of this with like work requirements or anything, but I'm just pointing out that that's another healthcare related program that could be caught up in all of this.
Yeah, my name's Steve Cohen. I'm a physician. I'm assuming that the members of Congress who deal with so many issues aren't masters of facts of everything that comes in front of them. I was just wondering how often do y'all maybe ask a question or about some health-related issue and they go, I didn't think of that, and it maybe changes their perspective or approach to the issue?
I think it does certainly happen sometimes where we'll ask a question of a lawmaker and they don't understand what we're asking. And it is like a very fine line because we want their, public officials, if they're speaking on this issue, they should know what they're talking about. But I think it's a lot easier to make something up than to admit that you don't know. And so I don't know that we, are having full on like policy conversations with lawmakers. We usually get like 30-second increments, but that's usually about the amount of time we have before they duck into an elevator. But I think it is so helpful for us to have those longstanding relationships with staff. So I can text them and say, hey, your boss said this. Like, is that true? Like, does he actually think that? Or were they confused? And so I think that just having those, it's our responsibility to figure that out and to have those conversations in the front end and just making sure we're accurately representing what people are saying, kind of walking that line between accountability and accuracy.
Yeah, no, I'd say that too, especially the part where it's easier to sort of talk about what you do know than to say, oh, I didn't think of that. Maybe you're right or something like that. And rarely do the conversations go that long. And you also do have a familiarity at this point, all of us do, with the lawmakers who do pretty intimately know what the bills are and what they say and what their problems are with another bill, for instance. And that'll be because, there's someone like the senator you just spoke to who is the sponsor of that legislation, or, they've spoken on this pretty authoritatively before.
Yeah, we spend a lot of our time trying to dial in our questions for lawmakers. I mean, you don't want to get too specific. It's not that they're dumb. They're doing a lot. They're dealing with a lot of different policies, many of which aren't even healthcare. And I don't really expect anybody to be able to be an expert on everything all at once off the top of their head. So you have to kind of know how far to go with the question and know where to hold back.
John, you're being much too diplomatic. Not all these members know these subject matter. Anyway, go ahead, Catherine.
Thanks. I'm Rob McGarrah with Maryland Legal Aid. STAT's done some really excellent reporting on United Healthcare, and we're now moving into the period with Medicare Advantage and the open enrollment period for Medicare. One of the big issues that we've seen, and we've heard it from other legal aid operations as well, is that both the AARP, which basically promotes United Healthcare and receives reportedly multiple payments, millions and millions of dollars every year for promoting Medicare Advantage. AARP people tell us, their top people tell us that they don't think Medicare Advantage is the preferred way to go. They prefer original Medicare for people because it provides more choices. At the same time, there's also a provision that was put in during the Bush administration where employers and labor unions can effectively automatically enroll their healthcare retirees in Medicare Advantage without their choice. The individuals can't make any choice. And United Healthcare is in one offering millions of dollars again as subsidies to employers In fact, the recently indicted mayor of New York, he just reported in the Times today, told the retirees there that they were going to get $600 million in savings if they put everybody in Medicare Advantage. Is this something that you think you could open up a little bit more? Because it's quite a can of worms.
I'm gonna defer this, given we're just about out of time. It is a can of worms, but it's a can of worms worth looking into. Is Lizzie Lawrence around? Where's Lizzie? Okay, Lizzie is one of our reporters, covers the FDA, and she's one of our on the United team doing those big stories. So you two should connect before you leave today. Why don't we take one more question from the audience? Oh, you wanted a quick answer.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I can just say more to come. And my fellow reporters and I have been emailing lawmakers with the investigation and trying to really get in front of the people who can in government who can look into this. So hopefully something comes of that. And yeah, we'll chat more later because I'd love to hear your thoughts.
One more question.
Good morning. I'm Meredith Isola. I'm with Servier Pharmaceuticals. We're based in Boston, but we're a global company headquartered in France. Biosecure Act. Thoughts? We are concerned as a global company. We're concerned here in the U.S. about our API. Where do you see that heading now that the House has voted for it? Do you think it'll pass with the next Congress? And what should companies like Servier, I mean, we're already planning, trust me, but what do you, from your perspective, think are going to be some of the biggest issues ahead?
All right, this is all me. The House did not attach Biosecure to the Defense Authorization Act. That is still seen as the primary vehicle that has to be passed this year. They always pass it. It's not like any other bill. It has passed for decades every year. So if you can get attached to it, you're good. And there's still opportunity for Biosecure to be attached to the NDAA in the Senate. So it might happen this year, actually, not next year. There's a lot of bipartisan support for it. There's a lot of animosity toward China right now. It's complicated, and you're a perfect example of a company that's caught in the crossfire. I'm sorry.
I will say as well, I think, especially when we look at kind of your December timeframe, that at some point, like staff or the leaders, like the top leaders in the House and Senate will get together and they're going to hash it out. And it just depends kind of how far up on the priority list those things are. We understand that it is, a fairly high priority for House Republicans, but it's really hard to tell how all of those conversations are going to play out. As Senator Hassan said, like, we just don't know what the balance of power is going to be in the influence. But I think it is certainly a priority that will be on the table for the end of the year.
Well,
yeah, it's not a guarantee. There's a decent chance.
Thanks to our reporters and let me just go right to our final closer, the esteemed Matt Herper, who's our senior writer for medicine, as well as our editorial director of events at STAT.
Thanks, Rick. So cheer for some applause for these guys. This is fantastic. Also for the sessions earlier, and I wanted to note Catherine McPhail, who's been moderating and emceeing up here all morning. This was Catherine's first time emceeing. I thought she did a fantastic job. So we also have a round of applause about that. So you guys can hang out if you want, but you are also actually free to go. I am Matt Herper. I am the editorial director of events. This is going to be fast. I hope I'm known for my fast closings for things like this. It's even more important at evening events when there are drinks outside. But a couple things that I do want to say. This was a STAT event. We put on a lot of these. If you don't know, I know a lot of your subscribers, but I just want to tell you about some of the other ones that we're doing. This was a great show. Our big show
is on October 16th and 17th in Boston. And there's a lot of things I think that people here might be interested in. Sarah's going to be interviewing Atul Gawande. Rachel we were talking about getting inside the White House in a Trump administration. Rachel's going to be interviewing Joe Grogan, who was a key healthcare advisor to Trump. We're also going to have a gamut of people from the pharmaceutical industry. Alnylam Pharmaceutical CEO on Green Street, Biogen's Jane Grogan. I will be talking to the CEO of Bristol Myers Squibb about the IRA negotiation process. And we will have a panel on United Healthcare, so you don't want to miss that. We also will be doing, we're announcing that Bob Duggan and Mackie Zangano, which isn't quite the DC area, but is probably the hottest story in biotech, from Summit Therapeutics, which is a company that's just released data of its drug beating Keytruda, the best-selling drug in the world, will also be on stage. We will also, for people who can't make it up to Boston, there's a summit in DC in March. You're probably not West Coast people, but there's a summit in San Francisco in May. We'd love to see you at any of these, and we're rolling out more of these events at medical meetings. And meetings like JP Morgan. If you go to JP Morgan, come to the JP Morgan event. Thank you to our event sponsor, Alexion, AstraZeneca Rare Disease, and to all of you for joining us here this morning. We will have the space open and available for additional networking for the next hour, so feel free to stay or feel free to grab a coffee on the way out. Yes. Yes. Come on, Rick. Let's do we have more shameless plugs. I'm sorry.
Hardly my job, and apologies for this, but we build our great journalism that costs millions of dollars to produce on really the subscription business, people buying subscriptions. They are not cheap. About half of you have subscriptions. But we are now running a 33 months for $30 special, which is like a bargain basement thing. So if you don't have a subscription, please support our journalism. Go on our site if you don't mind, and $30 for 3 months, and support it. We don't have like lots of money to spend on perks or anything. We put it back into the journalism. So thanks.
It's really great when you're writing about a company and they're mad to be paid for by subscribers. Thanks so much, everyone. Great to see you.